The first part of our journey through a story told in a book called Luke has had the theme title, Who Does He Think He Is? It won't be a surprise to you to think or guess that this story is about someone called Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth. I talk about him a lot. His story is at the centre of a lot of things that we do together. This writer, who we call Luke, is putting his stuff together about 30 to 40 years after the life and the death and the resurrection of this Jesus of Nazareth. And it seems like he's writing to encourage new and those who've been followers of Jesus for a while in the face of what they're facing in the face of the Roman Empire. He's introduced his story over the first more or less 3 chapters by telling us quite a lot about a birth, and a birth that has a lot of promise around it. And then he's just given us a tiny glimpse of Jesus as a teenage boy, causing upset, stirring things up in Jerusalem in the temple. And then he's told us quite a lot about a man called John, who has also been building expectations and stirring things up in the Jewish people of the time. He's been telling them to turn around. He's been telling them to come back to be who they were made to be. And as a sign of that, he's been asking them to be immersed, to be baptized in the river. At this point in history, in the ancient Near East and first century Palestine, the Jewish people are struggling to remember who they are in the face of the power and the messages and the grinding down of the Greek and the Roman Empire. Up to this point in the story, we haven't heard actually anything about Jesus the man. We've had our expectations built up. We know something big is going on. We've been reminded about a bigger story. Luke's included lots of references back to the bigger Jewish story, the story of the Jewish people, the story of a God who's made promises and who's promised to bring things together and put things back together. So now, Jesus, the man, walks onto Luke's stage. And the first thing that happens is he doesn't say anything. Instead, he is, or in fact, he's already been in this story, he's already been baptized, immersed in the river. Just like all the other people of Jerusalem who've come to this man, John, who've heard this message of turning things around and remembering who they were supposed to be, and as a sign of that, going under the water. Jesus does the same, and then he prays. So, the question is, who does he think he is? We don't know exactly yet. He hasn't said anything. He's been baptized, and that might be a way for Luke to suggest now things are starting, or it might be a way for Luke to be suggesting that in some ways Jesus is just like everyone else at the time. But what Luke does include is that Jesus prays, and he's going to say that again and again and again in his story. Prayer's a word, a term that we use for talking and listening to God. The Jesus we get a picture of in these stories is a Jesus who seems to pray naturally, just like breathing. As he prays here, something remarkable happens. The description is that heaven opens, which is a Jewish way of saying that God gets involved, that God is revealing something, that God is speaking. It then says something called the Holy Spirit descends on Jesus in the form of a dove. That term, Holy Spirit, it is in the language that is written down here, the language of either the Greek or the Hebrew, a word for spirit, a word for breath, a word for wind, a word for presence. And these writers use it to talk about God's presence in his world. That's followed by a voice from heaven. And heaven, again, in these stories, isn't a far-off place in the clouds. Heaven is around us. Heaven presses down on us. Heaven is the reality of where God is and how he operates. And sometimes it's just another word for God's presence. There's a voice from heaven, and this voice says, "This is my son, with whom I am well pleased." Luke's first hearers, who would be hearing this read out loud to encourage them, would be used to hearing their Jewish scriptures read out loud in the synagogue and used to hearing them at home and memorising their stories. And they would hear the echoes in this phrase of one of their great songs in the Psalms, Psalm 2, and echoes of one of their favourite prophets, the stories that they clung on to of God's messages of how he would turn things around and how he would remind them who they were. In Isaiah 42 in particular, which talks about God's Son, and that's what Israel was supposed to be, but also that Son being a servant. Locked down, unable to be who they believed they were made to be, under the boot of the Roman Empire, under the messages, the stories, the chipping away day by day that took away their identity. Messages of power, of consumption, of materialism, of entertainment to dull things, of self-centeredness. They tried to cling on to these messages from their poets, from their prophets. Messages about a God who would hear the cry of the oppressed, who would set the oppressed free, who would turn things around, who would put things back together, who would set them free to be who they were made to be. And so in these messages were the idea of a person, one who was anointed. And that's where the word Messiah comes from. Maybe a priest or a prophet or a king who would come and change things. You were anointed by having a drop of oil placed on your head. Here, Jesus is anointed, but not with oil, but with God's presence. And these words are words of hope and promise that this is going to be the kind of son, the kind of servant that their God made them to be, but they had failed at for so many times in their story. And then we get in Luke a long, pretty dull, certainly really hard to read out loud list of names. 77 names. Jesus of Nazareth's family tree. The kind of thing is pretty dull to read, to hear, read out. Something is you're working your way through a story to skip over. But for Jewish listeners, a family tree was really important. In actual fact, for most of the ancient Near East, if you read the stories and the accounts, the histories of the time, ancestors were really important to your identity, to your story. Luke, in his list, it's 77 after all, which is a clue. He's not trying to write an accurate name-by-name list of Jesus' ancestors. Lots of these ancestor lists, parts of them anyway, from some of the lists and the names in that list, were actually lost, and so it's unlikely that he could actually have the exact right names. That's not what he's trying to do. Not that he's trying to make something up. The ancestors he does mention are the same kind of ones that are in another list in Matthew, and would match up with what makes sense in a Jewish story. But that's not what Luke is trying to do. He's an artist. This is part of his story. And he takes Jesus of Nazareth's real line of ancestors and he orders it to highlight that something special is going on. He picks out and key names leap out. Jewish listeners would know about Zerubbabel because he was a prince, and so this is a royal line. They would know about David, one of their greatest kings, and one who had been promised that from his line would come the one who was going to change things. Further back, you see Abraham is there. And Abraham's the father of all the Jewish people, the one who received the promises. But those promises were not just that his family, his nation would be blessed, but they would be a blessing. And that's why the list keeps going. And it keeps going all the way back to someone called Adam, which simply means man, human. This list is a reminder that this story is about not just Jesus' family, not just the Jewish family, but about God's family, which is all children. All Luke's listeners are children of Adam. This is a story for every single one of us. Not just a Jewish story, we are all, Luke will remind us time and time again, part of the blessing machine, and all God's children, despite the messages from any other source telling us that we're somehow different from each other. And there's more. Luke's list goes one step further, makes an outrageous claim that this man, being baptized, anointed with God's presence, about to begin everything that we know so much about, is, yes, one of us, part of a human family, part of the Jewish story, but is also Son of God. Who does he think he is? Who do you think you are? Let this amazing story remind you.